So it begins by saying, make thee an ark of gopher wood, rooms shalt thou make in the ark, and shalt pitch it within and without with pitch. So we're getting this description of, we want the ark to be waterproof. We're going to pitch it on the outside and on the inside with this pitch. And quite frankly, we could get all excited about the scientific reasoning and rationale for why we would use tar on the inside and the outside and what the length would be and reconstruct it. And that would be fun for some people. But in my mind, I want to keep saying, what in the world is God trying to teach us? Because keep in mind, these scriptures were given very, very anciently to a people originally for a particular reason, but God has preserved them. They've come down to us today. So while they were given to those people back then in antiquity, and they were for them then, they are also for us today. And so we have to keep asking the question, what did God intend for us to get from these stories? I don't know that He intended for us to have it be a handbook, like you had said, on geology, archaeology, anthropology, linguistics.
Or how to build boats.
Or how to build the ideal ark.
Or debate, like, how many animals could you fit in a boat? God is basically just saying, there's a plan here to save people.
That's right.
And there's a bunch of details, but if we just step back and say, God actually has a plan to save His faithful people.
Absolutely.
And so there's little details, but guess what? The details will be different for you and for me today because the circumstances are different. And so He might give you specific things for how you can get into the good boat Zion or help build it and be saved. And we probably don't have to bring a lot of tar and pitch.
So look at verse 15. He gives the length and the breadth and the height. Verse 16, a window shalt thou make to the ark, and in a cubit thou shalt finish it above, and the door of the ark shalt thou set in the side thereof. And then he describes a lower, second, and third stories inside of it. Those of you who like marking your scriptures physically, you could make a little note there in chapter 16.
Verse 16.
Or verse 16, footnote A, where it mentions the window. You'll notice the Hebrew word down there, sohar. Am I pronouncing that okay?
Well, I'm not an ancient Hebrew, but it sounds good to me.
Some rabbis believed it was a precious stone that shone in the ark. Fascinating, because if you look at the timing here, you get Noah and the flood, and then you get the next story in chapter 11 that we're going to finish today's episode with in the Tower of Babel story. And it's at the Tower of Babel where you get your first connection over to the New World with the Book of Mormon people, the Jaredites. And what does the brother of Jared end up doing to fix his light problem when the Lord told him, what would thou have me do, that you'll have light in your vessels? And he had fashioned those smooth stones and then asked God to touch them. Is it possible that a few, I don't know exactly how long it is, a few hundred years before the brother of Jared, Noah is kind of the big prophet of his dispensation, stands at the head of that dispensation. Is it possible that he's been reading his scriptures, knows the stories, harkens back to what Noah did? So to solve problems that the brother of Jared is facing, he looks to the prophet and looks to the solutions that God has already provided through his prophet, and then follows the prophet and finds light and life in his own struggles there in the barges, a few hundred years removed from this. It's beautiful. How simple technique God uses these stones, a farm boy, simple people to do his work and to carry it forth into the world. I love it. Now, go with verse 18. But with thee will I establish my covenant, and thou shalt come into the ark, thou and thy sons, and thy wife, and thy sons' wives with thee. There's the 8 that are mentioned. Look at the Joseph Smith translation in your footnote there, footnote 18a. But with thee will I establish my covenant, even as I have sworn unto thy father Enoch, that of thy posterity shall come all nations. And then he finishes with, and thou shalt come into the ark. So it's this beautiful carrying on of a promise that God has given to Enoch. And we know that God gave that promise to Adam and Eve before. And it keeps getting passed down. It keeps getting renewed. It keeps experiencing this new beginning with each dispensation, or in some cases, each generation. That God is saying, yeah, I promised this to your fathers before. And that's important, and that'll help you, that'll bless you. But even more important, I'm giving it to you today. And I think that the message for me is, I love looking at the genealogy pedigree charts for me and my wife, and consequently for our children, and seeing the legacy of faith and all the covenants and the promises that have been made up through there, and then back into the scriptures to these great people of old. But brothers and sisters, those promises given to these people back then, or even to people in my genealogy pedigree chart, they only can bless me so much until I make them my promises as well, till I claim them, like Noah was seeking after them, and next week, like Abraham is going to seek after them. There's power in not sitting back and waiting for these covenants to come and hit us over the head, but rather go and seek them, to seek the Lord early and often, and do our best to find connections to those covenants. Now, let's finish this chapter with verse 22, something that is powerful in my mind. It's so simple that it's easy to overlook, but it's back to these small and simple things that great things are brought to pass. Thus did Noah according to all that God commanded him. Did you notice? Thus did Noah. Noah did all that God had commanded him. So did he. So it repeats it. God makes the command, and he did it. He does it. It's not like the people, in contrast back there in Moses chapter 8, where on 3 occasions it says, and they hearkened not unto his word. They didn't listen to him. They didn't obey. They didn't follow. Whereas Noah did. Now, check out chapter 7, verse 5. And Noah did according unto all that the Lord commanded him. I don't know. I don't think that Moses has a problem repeating himself as this story is being written down. I think there's an emphasis being added to this idea of obedience to God, that we've got to trust him and do according to the things which he has commanded us. And now, back to Taylor's numbering thing, verse 6. Noah was 600 years old when the flood of waters was upon the earth. They love the nice round numbers, the ability to encapsulate a big passage of time in something fairly round.
Well, today we might say he's a century old. So in a sesagesimal system where it's like base 60, 600 would be that nice round number. We're not saying Noah wasn't 600 years old. We're just saying that the Bible writers may have been using these numbering systems to kind of convey something about how old he was. That it just registers, like today we say, that person's a century old, that's 100 years. 100 years is a long time for us. 600 we don't really compute. Back then, it did compute for them. You even see the 40, right? 40 days it rains. Now, maybe it really rained for 40 days. I've lived in places where that's happened, but it also just may mean a very long time, which in the scriptures, 40 symbolizes a really long time.
That's right. You'll notice that the flood comes, they're in the ark. Chapter 7 talks about 2 and 2 of all flesh, but it's later on where you get the description of the 7 clean animals, not 2, because we're going to perform sacrifices when the
Right.
ark lands, and that's a little problematic if we've only got 2.
Right.
So, verse 17, the flood was 40 days, as Taylor said, upon the earth, and the waters increased and bare up the ark, and it was lift up above the earth. The waters prevailed and were increased greatly upon the earth, and the ark went upon the face of the waters.
If you look at verse 24, it prevails upon the earth, the waters, for 150 days. Again, if you do that sesagesimal counting, 30, 60, 90, 120, 150. It's another
easy
30
round
base number.
So then, as we're coming to the end of that experience, he sends forth the raven in chapter 8, verse 7, and then the dove in verse 9, and the dove comes back. And then another 7 days, he sends out the dove, and this time she had an olive leaf plucked off in her beak in verse 11.
You guys remember what Noah's name means? It means rest. And actually, if you were reading this in the Hebrew, you would actually find Noah's name repeated a number of places where it's actually not referring to him, but it's actually using the word rest. For example, the ark rests on the mountaintop. When he sends out the bird, it at first couldn't find a place to rest its foot. So the theme is being purposely baked into the literary format of the text, that it's about rest, that God will bring rest. And if you stay on God's covenant path, eventually the floodwaters of the suffering of your life will recede and you will be at rest. That is actually everything about what Noah's name means. And even though we know the story happened, for us today, the symbolism is we're all like a Noah looking to find our rest in the Lord.
Noah builded an altar unto the Lord, and took of every clean beast and of every clean fowl, and offered burnt offerings on the altar, as he's now off the ark. You'll notice the footnote there takes you to Genesis 9, 4 through 6 in the appendix. That happens to be the very first entry of the larger Joseph Smith translation adjustments in the back, chapter 9, verse 4 through 6. Notice the adjustment that Joseph adds here. And Noah builded an altar unto the Lord, and took of every clean beast and of every clean fowl, and offered burnt offerings on the altar, and gave thanks unto the Lord, and rejoiced in his heart. And the Lord spake unto Noah, and he blessed him. And Noah smelled a sweet savor, and he said in his heart, I will call on the name of the Lord, that he will not again curse the ground any more for man's sake, for the imagination of the man's heart is evil from his youth, and that he will not again smite any more every living thing as he hath done while the earth remaineth. That's a pretty big promise, which now leads us over into chapter 9, where you get God blessing Noah and his sons, and he said, be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth. You'll notice that was the very first command given to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. And it's still in force today, the same command that had been given in the beginning and here at this new beginning, and it's given at a new beginning of a new family unit every time a man and a woman kneel across the altar in the temples of our God. I love that idea of we need family to be able to fulfill God's plan for us. And again, we've talked about this before. We realize not everybody has that opportunity, or not everybody gets that ideal. Some people have a real situation in their life that prevents that ideal from occurring. We understand that. With God, all things will be made right in the end. Now, God gives them a sign in verse 10 through 16 of the rainbow being established as a sign of that covenant, that he won't, well, let's just read verse 12. And God said, this is the token of the covenant which I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for perpetual generations. So it's this ongoing sign. I do set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be for a token of a covenant between me and the earth. And he promises that he will not destroy all flesh anymore, in the bottom of verse 15.
I love this word token. Listen to the words, at least in English, the root word for token comes from the same word where we get to teach, to show, to explain. So Jesus, or God, as the great teacher, has an ongoing teaching moment, an object lesson that is there after anytime it rains or a mist. It's his reminder, his teaching object lesson that he made this covenant to Noah and all of Noah's posterity, which includes all of us, that he will never again destroy the earth with a flood. And God holds to his promises. So I just love how God teaches us, not just in word, but also visually with the world around us that he created.
Powerful. Now, as they move out from there, verse 19, these are the three sons of Noah, and of them was the whole earth overspread. So our biblical account talks about Shem, Japheth, and Ham spreading out and multiplying and replenishing the earth.